Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 29th of June and I've been on a 1 week hiatus as you may have noticed, and during that time a lot has changed around the front line. If we're looking for instance just south of Kostyantynivka, there were some key changes. Around Krasnohorivka there were also developments that I'm going to get into today. On the Pokrovsk direction, you could say. There have also been some changes. And then looking further north at the canal district of Chasiv Yar, east of the Donbass Canal, some Russian movement over there. Further north, if we're looking at the area east of the Zherebets River, the Ukrainians have been able to slightly push eastwards. And then there were also some key developments around Vovchansk. And so let's begin by looking at the region south of Kostyantynivka. And before I get into that, I just want to say that this hiatus that I've been on is likely going to be the last one in 2 months, because I'm going to be free this summer to upload on a daily basis. And really my schedule is cleared up for that specifically. And so I am excited to work and really do something that is more in depth. Today's video, even though it's going to probably be long, is going to be more surface level because I just have to go over so much material that I missed. But in future videos, it's going to be much more analysis oriented. But let's begin by looking at these changes. Around 22nd and 23rd of June, this is when the Russians activated this part of the front line. They were able to capture various fields and Ukrainian dugouts, trenches, and tree lines that were set up in the region over the course of the past several months. The Russian forces advanced, if we look at the extent, 1.8 kilometers westwards. And I'll show you guys using the arrows the extent of their advances in some of these particular regions, as was marked in mapping, essentially agreed upon by all sources and then verified recently by geolocated footage, especially in the regions that are just southeast of Kostyantynivka. And so this is really just a part of Russia shaping the battlefield in these fields, trying to get control over various local hills. And those hills, as you can see, they span this region over here, the area here as well. And then we also look at the region east of Mikhailsk, a region where there was a Ukrainian presence, albeit a rather small amount, that was sort of holding out and acted as a salient that overlooked the Russian garrison consisting of the naval infantry in Mikhailsk, or actually the 36th Brigade. And now the Russian forces, after really months of not being able to shift the battlefield in this region, they were able to push back the Ukrainians from that important hill. And you could see the polygon, which basically showcases the extent of the Russian advance, nearly 15 square kilometers in this region, advancing through the quarry area, getting control over some of the local hill in this region, which will give the Russians the advantage of overlooking certain portions of the valley on which this local road runs through. But in terms of elevation, and I'm not talking about this field over here, because this field over here is on a relatively low elevation, but if we're looking at the next Ukrainian strongholds behind the road, that would include Vuhledar, of course, the coal mine in the region, Vodyane. Those areas are, of course, still significant heights that the Ukrainians maintain. That's also part of why the Russian forces have try to strengthen their flank directly to the east by advancing through these various regions that were previously considered to be a gray zone. And they've been doing this gradually over months, trying to advance with vehicles, dismount forces. Sometimes they're repelled, but you could see how gradually they've been able to push towards, for instance, this natural barrier with the tree line. And now if we look further north, there was previously an attempt, I would say last month, by the Russians to infiltrate into southeastern Kostyantynivka. They were rather close to doing so, but were eventually repelled by the 79th Brigade, and you had an organization of reinforcements by the Ukrainians. What is interesting is that now we're seeing footage of one of these reinforcement units, the Skala Battalion, at least partially being rediverted to Chasiv Yar because the situation is really dire there as well. And so maybe that's playing a role in the Russians recently being able to reactivate and exploit certain gaps in the front line. If we look at recent videos here, we'll see that a Russian vector of attack developed along the road directly from Novomikhailivka into Kostyantynivka, and perhaps from the parallel fields further south. Here's just some footage from the region. It was actually the 79th Brigade repelling Russian assault, damaging, I believe, 2 armored fighting vehicles and 1 BMP-3 in that entire encounter. But it also gives us an idea of where the Russians are trying to push through, because now they have direct access into the approaches of the village, and of course they're strengthening their southern flank. They have not cut off the road to Vuhledar yet, although it is hard to see how supplies are moving through that area. But of course, reaching the road itself, which is about 2 kilometers west of the line of contact, would limit the capabilities basically of various nodes connecting together on the front line, because as you can see, there aren't many other roads in this general southern Donetsk region that are connecting between the two chains of villages that the Ukrainians have in this region. And so that one road is very important for the Ukrainians, because they would have to do this massive sort of U-turn in order to reach Vuhledar or Kostyantynivka, respectively. Looking at Krasnohorivka, recently the Russians have poked holes in the natural defense barriers that the Ukrainians have tried to set up. Let's look in detail at this. So the region that is about 200 meters south of the refractory plant, it was actually a sort of holdout for the Ukrainians, because they held several blocks in the residential areas, and there was just a period of time where the Russians were unable to push through, or maybe they weren't even attempting to assault the region head on. But you could see it marked over here. And in recent days, we've received geolocations from the Ukrainian side confirming the advance of the Russians here, which makes sense because, of course, the Russians want to cleanse the remaining Ukrainian holdouts in these various private residences as they try to secure the perimeter of Krasnohorivka, which would give them access to this railway vector for further advances towards the Vovchansk River in the region later on. But here's a video from June 28th, which shows the Ukrainians dropping grenades onto the Russian forces in those same houses. And in terms of what remains, you have, of course, these warehouses in the region, which we don't have verification yet of a Russian advance over there. And that's about it in terms of Ukrainian presence in southern Krasnohorivka. Now, on the flip side, the Russian forces are advancing past the refractory plant where there was very heavy fighting. The Ukrainians, of course, tried to set up this horizontal line along the main road bisecting the town, and that was unsuccessful, especially in this western region, because there are less high-rise apartment buildings when you go several kilometers northwards. And so once the Russians were able to overwhelm the Ukrainians in the initial dozen apartment buildings in the region just north of Kurova Street, by then the Russians were able to dominate the battlefield in the region. And if you zoom out actually and look at elevation, for instance, really all of the regions that Russia controls south of the refractory plants are just an extension of a ridge that runs from the east from the Russian holdings from before the war, or I guess you could say the DPR holdings from even before the war began. And so the Russians do, of course, have that advantage, and we're using that as a way to support their advances. If we look at the gains, here's the June 23rd video, Ukrainians dropping grenades onto western private residential area, and that is from this geolocation over here, confirming, if we look at it, an advance of around 300 meters northwards. In this video, I think is a bit older, but nonetheless, it does confirm the Russians being able to undermine the Ukrainian defense in this region. And so we look forward and we see that there still is a large chunk of residential buildings in this region that the Ukrainians maintain control over. And then the Krasnohorivka region extends westwards towards a local tributary. And so that area is really the final bastion for the Ukrainian forces east of the Vovchansk River. And really, the fall of Krasnohorivka would spell the end of any sort of large organizing point for Ukrainian forces in a really large part of the front line. If we're measuring the Vovchansk River in the region, where it spans like 15 kilometers, maybe more, of the line of contact. And so it is something that the Ukrainians have, of course, taken into heart, really. And it's a big part of why they moved in reinforcements, for instance, from the 59th Motorized Brigade and from various air assault units. But that has not been enough to really prevent the Russians from advancing past the various horizontal roads here. We could see that, for instance, in the area north of Artema Street. Let's measure the extent of the Russian advance around 140 meters northwards along this rectangle. Looking further eastwards, the Russian forces were able to really cleanse a large part of the gray zone, because if you look on my previous mapping, it amounted to something like this, I would say, where there was just a lot of no man's land, because you had back and forth where the Ukrainians were largely accepted to be in control over this apartment complex, which really gives them a large advantage overlooking the various fields approaching the apartment complex. And that was a big part of why the Russians couldn't solidify control over those regions. Then you had the fact that the Ukrainians tried to conduct localized counterattacks through those same fields, which were eventually repelled. But now the Russian forces, after a back and forth for several weeks in the region, have been able to reach the Centralna street in this region that runs horizontally here, and of course infiltrate into some of the apartment complexes in the region. And the fall of these apartment regions will really be a blow to the Ukrainian defenders in this region, because they are relying on it, because they don't have the natural elevation advantage from the hills. So they are trying to offset that by positioning themselves with snipers, ATGMs, a lot of scouts, for instance, and drone operators in these apartment buildings in the higher floors. And now a lot of them are compromised. Really, they can't operate freely in most of them, and the Russian forces are already beginning to take them over. And when you look at how far away it is from the hospital region, it's only about 300 meters. In that hospital area is very important. Now the Russians are flanking it from the south and from the east, where the Russians also advance. If you look at the extent of the gains, something like 300 meters westwards. And you do have that advance going along Nakhimova Road, very important road bisecting much of northern Krasnohorivka. And this hospital node really is an organizing point for Ukrainian defenders. And the fall of it would also give the Russians control over another really important vantage point that essentially gives them domination over the various other private residential areas. That hospital is really the last major structure that the Ukrainians have, bar the apartments further south. The rest of it really is just private one-story buildings. Now, looking at the Pokrovsk direction, which is what I'm going to refer to it now, I guess you could say Vovchansk River front interchangeably. But we're moving away from Avdiivka just because now it's like 15 kilometers west of the city, and it's really reaching a point where a lot of roads pushing into Pokrovsk, the Russians are trying to close in on. And so beginning with the region north of Natelove really has been important for the Russians. They've used it as a springboard. A lot of their DPR forces, for instance, drone operators, tanks, other vehicles have organized there, and you could see how a lot of roads branch out. And so it has been very important in allowing them to advance further westwards along this road over here into the northern section of Karlivka, just north of the local pond in the region. And this was backed up by geolocated footage from June 25th, showing Russian forces dismounting from, I think it was an MTLB, in a forested region near the Karlivka settlements. And then from there was an engagement where the Ukrainians, they send in reinforcements across the reservoir, and you could see them come through this narrow choke point, and then from there dismounting their forces in this region over here, this marker. And there was a Ukrainian vehicle, hard for me to remember which one, but it was destroyed by Russian drones during the same engagement. And so that tank, which was supposed to be a part of pushing back the Russians from the various forested regions east of Karlivka, was eventually repelled itself. And so the Russian forces now have this foothold that is rather close to the Karlivka reservoir crossing. And you could see that is dangerous because besides these few houses that remain, the Russians are only about, I guess, 1 kilometer southeast of that crossing. And there still are some Ukrainian elements, actually more in some cases, because there are still troop rotations the Ukrainians are conducting, mainly from 25th Airborne Brigade and some from the 56th Motorized Brigade. Although I've said this before, but 56th Brigade is split up between 3 different fronts right now, and so only a small portion of it is really here and defending. And so what has happened is, despite the fact that the supply lines into, I guess, what I would refer to as the Zherebets salient are getting tighter and tighter, the Ukrainians are firm in trying to maintain their line here. And the reason why is because they want to continue strengthening the regions west of the Vovchansk River. They want to continue building up these trenches. The mapping here in yellow is not up to date, so of course I'll get the new and the latest updates on the satellite imagery to show you guys what the actual Ukrainian construction progress is over here. But the point is, they started off by building these massive strong points, presumably a lot of them on hills, and now they're trying to connect them together in order to prevent any sort of holes from being formed. And that's why they're sending in reinforcements, some of them coming in on MRAPs, for instance, or on some lighter vehicles and dismounting in Zherebets, just to prolong the fighting just enough to give the Ukrainians more time to build. And we can see how the Russians are trying to clear out what remains of Zherebets, which is a very small hamlet. First, we got understanding of the Russian presence here over a week ago, and that's when the 25th Brigade engaged with the Russians. Here's a video from June 27th showing a slight Russian advance 100 meters westwards, dropping grenades onto Russian forces in houses in the village, and also FPV strikes on those same ruins. And here we have one other video. We'll see what it shows. This is actually an older video, but again, you have the Sparta Battalion operating here, trying to pick off any sort of Ukrainian targets in the region. And so for now, the line holds where the Russian forces still only control the southeastern portion of Zherebets. Over the same 1 week period, Deep State has gradually come to accept that a lot of these fields south of Novopokrovsk really have been cleared by the Russians. But I don't think this is a particularly new development. I think that ever since we had that June 14th engagement, now like 2 weeks ago, you've had Russians essentially in control of these fields east of Novoselivka, Persha. And that's how they were able to use those regions as a springboard to advance along this paved road and begin to harass that said village. But since then, the Ukrainians really have concentrated their defense in that region and have prevented any sort of direct entrance from the east. And so for now, the line is sort of stabilized, where the Russians have this dividing line going north of Vovchansk along some of the tree lines. Going further north to Sokil, this area is important. We have a lot of confirmation of a lot of reports that I've talked about in videos from a week ago, and now we just have footage to back it up. And so it's not necessarily new changes. But first, we have this video from June 23rd, which shows just some of the fighting in the region, where the Ukrainians were able to destroy 2 Russian BTR-82s in eastern Sokil. This road is very important. You know, you have Russian elements coming in on a daily basis, coming in from this Solovyove region or further eastwards from the Berdichi and Novobakhmutivka region. And that road is under heavy Ukrainian artillery fire, drone fire as well, to try to just prevent as much infantry from dismounting in eastern Sokil as possible. But nonetheless, the Russian forces do maintain a presence there. They've not been able to push westwards directly into Voskhod and Ivanivka. And I think that's because the axes of advance are just so narrow that the Ukrainians, even if they do have attrited forces in many cases, are able to organize enough of a defense to just prevent the direct assaults or make them too costly. And now the Ukrainian defense in the region is centered around these tree lines that go further north, and there are trenches connected to them. And so the Ukrainians are trying to turn this into a sort of impromptu line based on what was previously constructed. What we see is the Russian forces advance in the region north of Sokil, which is an area that is geographically favorable to them. This was verified on June 24th by a video of a Russian soldier being hit in a rather shallow dugout. And you could see that it confirms an advance, which I referred to previously, but it's about, I guess you could say, 1 kilometer westwards. And this means that the entire trench system north of Sokil is under Russian control. That's a major fortress that the Ukrainians were unable to use to bleed out the Russians over an extended period of time. And now you do have further Russian momentum along this rail line region, which is, of course, located on the dominant height in the region, which gives the Russians an important advantage in overlooking the remaining parts of Sokil and the remaining villages east of the Vovchansk River. Looking at Novo-Oleksandrivka, we now have information of a Russian advance to the northwest, and you can see how the attack vector really does continue to be along that particular paved road that I talk about so much, that reaches the ring road on the highway to Pokrovsk. If we zoom out now, if we look at the distance away from that ring road, the Russians are about 7 kilometers away. But as I've said previously, keep an eye out for the fields that are just northeast of Novo-Oleksandrivka, this region. And so if there's any developments that come out of the recent Russian advances, around Novolexandrivka, then I think it could really be related to those fields over here. You could see a direct attack by the Russians northwards, just because this region in this field is on a important hill that overlooks a lot of the Ukrainian villages that are on floodplains in the region. And you can see how those floodplains sort of and the local streams sort of flow southwards in this region. And it does create a very difficult position to defend if we're looking at it from a topographic map in that perspective. But in terms of the actual concrete changes, we see here 3 videos, I believe. We'll click on them. You could see here, this is a video from June 24th showing Ukrainians shelling the Russian infantry that were operating in various houses and near ponds. There are several bushy areas near those ponds in Novolexandrivka, and so those particular Russian soldiers were noticed and struck by the Ukrainians. And so really there is an active defense by the Ukrainians where they're using a lot of artillery. I've seen a notable increase in the amount of shelling videos by the Ukrainians in this region. So it does appear that they have been able to receive some stockpiles, and it makes sense given the fact that this area is so important. And then we're also seeing a lot of drone footage compilations, especially coming from the 110th Brigade. They're really taking a active role as vanguard force here. And there have been some complaints from the Ukrainian channels regarding the performance of territorial units in this region. I'd assume they're referring to the 111th TDF Brigade because they were moved from the area around Telove to defend here. And perhaps they did not have the sufficient, I guess, generally wherewithal to hold the line here. And so mechanized forces from the 110th have become more active in recent weeks in containing the advances. But nonetheless, the Russian forces do continue to advance here. If we look at the extent of their advances, it's about 1.2 kilometers. And this is further verified on June 28th by a video from the 110th showing FPV strikes on Russian infantry, specifically in tree lines. And they're using these tree lines to gradually advance under some sort of concealment near these ponds along this parallel line to reach the nearby strongholds that are just on the outskirts of this other village, Vovchansk. And this is why I also think it's important to secure these northern fields, because you do have so much of a emphasis on one main road, and the flank north of it, there may not be a large Ukrainian concentration over there, but it would be more well protected if there was just a Russian buffer set up over there. It would also be more useful and expansive later on. If we're looking at the region around Toretsk, I really don't have much to say in terms of changes because there hasn't been enough verified in the past week. But we do have footage that confirms maybe it is a map correction. Perhaps this was not a Ukrainian counterattack, and maybe it was just some sort of issue in relation to the mapping of Ukrainian sources, actually, because a lot of these developments were reported by Deep State initially a week ago. But this is a video from June 25th showing TOS-1A shelling. There was some very heavy shelling in this video towards Ukrainian positions in the forest, and we'll show this forest for you guys just south of Sumy. This is a really important forest in the region because it is right next to the line of contact where you have the Russian trenches set up, and now, of course, you have Russian bombardment. The forest is being flanked from the north because you have a Russian troop presence in Sumy, and then you have, of course, a strong force garrison from the east, and it also acts as a sort of vanguard before you reach some other defenses that were built up in the region just to the east of the suburbs over here of Zhelizhne. And Pivdenia and Zhelizhne are very fortified regions. They're suburbs that have these houses that extend vertically to the northwest, I guess you could say, or you could say diagonally to the northwest. And they, of course, are protected in certain cases by these forested regions, which the Ukrainians do maintain control over, and that explains why the Russians are shelling it. And so I just slightly changed the map to indicate that the Russians are not in control of the regions that I mapped right now with red. But we do have verification now that the Russians were able to take advantage of the Mayorsk garrison and advance to the northwest along the paved roads in the region, along the rail line, and reach the Donbass Canal in this region. There are 2 videos that were released by the 28th Mechanized Brigade. This is a unit that was previously operating around Chasiv Yar. Maybe it still is to a certain extent. It was operating specifically in the regions around Klishivka, I would say, and perhaps even south of it, around Kordiumivka or Zarianivka. And so it's a lot, just logically makes sense for some of their elements to be moved a bit further south to Druzhba, Pivnichnya, to help contain any sort of Russian advance. And so now let's look at the videos. We had this video from the Rupak drone group, which showed FPVs hitting a building in the third lift pumping station, which the Russians reached over a week ago. And here we have a video from June 24th of them dropping mines onto the pumping station, causing damage to the structure. But again, we can't see anything happening to infantry. Now, the fact that the Russians were able to divert, I don't know how much of the brigade, I can't tell you guys, but the fact that they were able to divert at least one unit does mean that the defense of the Chasiv Yar region did become more difficult. Because remember, recently the Russian forces, they saw that the Ukrainians moved in the 24th Mechanized Brigade. And that specific unit was previously stationed in the region just west of Toretsk, or I guess you could say just west of Horivka. And so now the Russians saw the opportunity for that. And over the past week, they've taken advantage of it. And in a way, they've sort of reversed the dynamic, because you had the Ukrainians moving forces away from a low intensity front to a high intensity front to beef up manpower. And now they've been forced to walk that back by sending in a different unit to maintain control over that same low intensity front. So, of course, you have the advantage of diverting attention away from Chasiv Yar, and also of shaping the battlefield in a way that is more conducive for future advances in the Toretsk suburbs, although over the past week, the pace has undoubtedly slowed down. Looking at the canal district of Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians have made the decision to defend what remains in their control tooth and nail. So they're now withdrawing across the canal to the defensible positions along the trenches on the western bank of the canal. They're trying to maintain control of whatever remains, whether it be apartment complexes, I guess you could say tree lines, whatever remains of the garages and the concrete products facility. They're trying to hold on to it for as long as possible. For the same reason, they're trying to maintain control of Zherebets. They want to make sure that this line that runs along the canal is as strong as possible, that there are no gaps that the Russians can essentially play into and exploit, because in previous incidents over the past 2 months, the Russian forces have been able to reach the canal, and there were areas that may have not been as well built as others. There were areas where there were simply no Ukrainian defenders at the time, and only later reinforcements were sent in to push them back, which, of course, when the Russians are conducting DRG forays several kilometers westwards, you're able to do. But once the main fighting force reaches that region, it becomes a different equation. And so the Ukrainians really do have to be prepared for that if they're serious about maintaining control of Chasiv Yar, which is just an extremely important city in general, because of how high in terms of elevation it is compared to the surrounding regions. It really is an important node, and laying at the center of that is this specific region of the canal district that now the Russians are advancing through. And so we have some videos that verify the Ukrainian, I guess you could say, forward line, and then we could also see videos of Russian advances. So here's just one of them, a video from June 29th showing Ukrainian FPV strikes both on the region south of the district, in some of the local roads that are leading into it, where Russian soldiers were advancing through to get a foothold, and then also some strikes on the apartments, of course. And that verifies that the Russian forces were able to advance from the southeastern apartment complex, which they captured, I think it was in April or May, and then from there advancing westwards into this region over here, 200 meters. Then we look at the last apartment complex under Ukrainian control. It would be this one over here. In terms of how large this region is, it amounts to something like, you could say, 1 square kilometer in its size, or rather 6.7 hectares. And let's look at some of these videos from here, June 28th. This is one of a Ukrainian MRAP Max Pro. It was able to advance, I think it was through this road over here, Kostyantynivka, and it's one of those ones that crosses over the canal, makes its way into the district itself. And then from there, the vehicle, which again, they're using lighter vehicles here, ones that are pretty speedy and could quickly conduct their operations. In this case, it was actually a rotation where they made it to the line of contact. I think it was to either drop off new forces or, I guess, bring back any sort of wounded forces across the canal. That's something that happens very regularly around here. And as the Russians get closer and closer to the canal, they're going to be able to see a lot of those vehicles more and more. You're going to see more, I guess, reconnaissance on them from drones, and then artillery being fixed upon that particular region and direct fire. And so that is, of course, a danger. But the Ukrainians are still able to maintain a logistics from a logistical standpoint connection to this region. We look at some of these other videos from this region. There's an overview of the damage to the apartments. You could see it over here, just the sheer extent, most of it coming from shelling that damaged any sort of Ukrainian positions on the upper stories. Here we have Russian TOS-1A shelling of those same high-rise buildings in order to make it impossible for the Ukrainians to continue comfortably operating from there. And you can just see some of those other videos from the region. Here's one from the 98th Air Assault Division, and it shows their FPVs destroying an abandoned Ukrainian armored personnel carrier that was also involved in some of those rotations, but eventually had to be abandoned. Here's a video actually from June 28th, and it comes from the Scala Battalion, as I said previously, and so they're now operating around here. Their drones dropped grenades onto the Russian forces near the concrete plant in the northern part of the district. And this is a part of the Russians just continuing to advance from the garages and whatever they control of the concrete plant further to the southwest. And a lot of that's occurring along this particular forested region. And they are now rather close to the actual canal itself. And if we look at the extent of their advance, just for some reference in distance, it's like 300 meters. What the Ukrainians do still maintain, which is a question mark, would likely be this region around here, this forested region. But even that is now coming under some, I guess you could say, Russian probing, because you have DRGs that are coming from the Canal District and from Bohdanivka, and they're making their way through this forest and going north and south from the canal to Kalina, for instance. And so the Ukrainians may not have that firm of control over these forests in any case. And these forests are also on relatively low elevation, especially the region just south of Kalina. And those are the same regions that the Russians are now overlooking from positions either in the Canal District or further northwards in these fields that extend then into northern Kalina, for instance. And if we look at the latest videos, we see that there were some Russian DRGs that actually made it all the way to the canal region. They were able to advance a couple of hundred meters south of Kalina, and they were able to make it through paths that are very close to the canal, through the forested region, and all the way to this region, this, I guess you could say, on the ground region. It's an area where the pipelines are above ground and not within ditches. And those are some of the physical crossings through which Russian soldiers could easily get across to the 0506 road that is just to the west of the canal. And that's where you have Russian DRGs operating in the really the hopes of exposing Ukrainian weak points and potentially undermining them even more. And so here you had two Russian DRG operatives in this specific region that were filmed by the Ukrainian side. And then here we have a video from June 17th actually, but it shows just some of the casualty evacuations from the same region. But this should give us an idea of where the line of contact currently is, where a lot of this forested region and the nearby trenches are actually a gray zone, which is an issue because those same trenches, which are west of the canal, really should be fortified by the Ukrainians by now. They really did have a lot of time to set it up and to set up manpower in that same region on hills that are overlooking certain parts of the battlefield. Not all of them, of course, but still are on important ridges. And so far, we're seeing that some of them have already been marked as a gray zone due to these Russian probing efforts, which have really been bolstered by the fact that the Russians have been able to bisect Kalina and advance along this main road using vehicles and dismount further westwards. Now let's look at the region east of the Zherebets River, where the Ukrainians have been able to conduct important localized counterattacks that for the time being take pressure off of the villages of Tereny and Yampolivka, which were acting and still do act as a vanguard for the Ukrainians on this bridgehead, as I refer to it. So, according to Ukrainian sources, the efforts here started in late April to push the Russians back from their forward positions, which are centered around various forested regions leading directly into the Tereny-Yampolivka line. And so you had Ukrainian efforts that were really conducted in a brigade level, several brigades operating together, at the very least elements of their battalions that were coordinating, and their drone crews, of course, as well, also operating. And so I'm just going to look at some of the units off the top of my head that are operating, that did operate and continue to fight in this region. And that includes the 97th Battalion of the 60th Mechanized Brigade, which again is also split between several fronts. You look at the, what is this? The 49th Rifle Battalion. That's also a unit that's operating around here. But what I more so want to focus on is the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov. And one of their battalions, at the very least, was operating in this region east of Terny and was involved in the offensive activities. You also have elements of the 63rd Brigade, which is over here, if you see, or not 60th, but rather the 63rd, which I have marked in this region over here. And if we look at the extent of their advances, it's something around several hundred meters, nearing a kilometer if we measure with this stick over here. Let's see, it's something like 1.5 kilometers eastwards. And then further south, there is also an effort around here, just east of Yampolivka, also about 1.5 kilometers, pushing the Russians away from some of the dugouts that the Ukrainians created and from some of these areas that had very good concealment, and also paved the way for Russian vehicles to continue probing and pushing closer and closer to the Zherebets River. This was done by the Russians consistently over the course of really since the beginning of 2024. And they really were closing in, not at any sort of fast pace, but shaping the battlefield in a way that would have allowed them to seal off this bridgehead and push out the Ukrainians. And now this organized effort by whatever forces are operating in the region have been able to stymie these efforts for the time being, give the Ukrainians a bit of breathing space, because now there is a distance of, you could say, 3-4 kilometers between the Russians and where the river really is located. And so that's a question of whether the Ukrainians could slightly push them back more from some other forested regions, or whether the line here will begin to stabilize in the coming days. And if we look further south, there were also efforts that were started by the Azov Brigade, 12th National Guard unit, actually, and the 1st Berev National Guard Brigade. Those two units operated in conjunction and were able to push the Russians out of some trenches that were built by the Ukrainians along the Serebryansky forest line. And you could see some of them marked in yellow over here. Those are areas that, starting in late May, the Ukrainians were able to recapture. And using that ability, they were able to really set up a solid line here that will prevent the Russians from pushing deep and compromising any sort of Ukrainian depth in this region. And so now the Ukrainians do have rather solid positions near the line of contact in this forested region, even in areas where there is less forest, less foliage due to a lot of the shelling. And further north, you have efforts from the 63rd Brigade, where they're taking fire towards Russian positions just to the west of Dibrova, which gave us confirmation that the Ukrainians are operating in some of these fields that are relatively close to the Limanska road that runs horizontally and across the Zherebets River as well. Now, looking at Vovchansk, we have some interesting videos to cover. This is from June 24th of a Fab 3000 hitting a Ukrainian position in a building in the southern parts of the city. This is becoming more common now as the Russians, even though they're mainly using Fab 1500s, because 3 can be dropped from a Su-34, for instance, these 3000 bombs are being used on specific large targets. In this case, the bomb was able to destroy most of the building that was targeted in that particular strike, just completely flattening the region that it hit. And so, yeah, you could see that it has just a massive explosive yield. And that is something that I would be interested to see occur more, not just on the rear. It's not really rear if it's in southern Vovchansk, but something that could happen directly on the battlefield. For instance, on this apartment complex that the Ukrainians control right here, which is a very strong node that is preventing any sort of deeper Russian advance in northern Vovchansk towards the Vovcha River in this particular region. If we're looking at downtown Vovchansk, as I refer to it, we see that the Ukrainians were able to make slight advances really around Harina Street, and Dukhovnia Street. It's an advance of around 100, 200 meters northwards. The Russians or the Ukrainians rather, were able to get a foothold within school number 2. This is verified in the video recorded by a Ukrainian soldier on June 28th, where you can see just the other destruction in the background. But it also means that there's a relatively narrow corridor that connects the main Russian garrison, which is built I would say around the hospital region, the marketplace, the warehouses, and then going further eastwards through the park in the region towards the aggregate plant. Now it is a relatively narrow corridor, but the Russians do still control that region nonetheless. But you do have Ukrainian efforts occurring just to the west of it for the reason, of course, of trying to cut off the Russians, but also, of course, to advance further northwards along this highway region and just fully cleanse the downtown area, not just the aggregate plant, but the downtown region at large of a Russian force, with the hopes of creating a stable line that runs along Korolenka Street. Because if you look further eastwards, the Ukrainians already do have a rather solid line of control along Korolenka Street, even going further northwards. And the Ukrainians would like to create a stable line in this region that could essentially stymie any efforts by the Russians to reach the Vovchansk River. If we look at the areas further east, there was a Ukrainian localized counterattack in the region from June 24th. It was carried out by the Elite Brigade, specifically the Tsunami Regiment, and they really show this point of view of their fighting in the region, house to house combat, firing into basements. And this is in northern Vovchansk and indicates that there was a slight advance a couple hundred meters northwards from Hoholia Street all the way to this street over here that's running to the southeast. And so the Ukrainians are also trying to strengthen their perimeter in the region. And I forgot to mention this, but the 71st Jaeger Brigade is the unit that is trying to push northwards, north of the Vovchansk River. And so that's all for today. I know that I could have been more specific in some of the updates, but that's something that I intend to do tomorrow. I hope you guys like the new mic. And that's all for today. So thank you guys and goodbye.